this really brings us into the different views of the world that I mentioned previously. The constrained versus the unconstrained vision of, gosh, what I am dealing with is the combination of so many brilliant minds over so many centuries. This is what I should defer to. Even though I really think this is wrong, I should defer to that. That's certainly showing some humility. However, once you're at that level, you should have the confidence to recognize that morality is objective.
Hey everybody, Patrick McFarland here. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. Just wanted to remind you how you can support the show. That's on patreon.com/Liberty Weekly. There's tier levels there and tons of archive bonus content. Also, if you are not a member of the Liberty Weekly Elite, please check out the Liberty Bigly podcast at anchor.fm/Liberty Bigly. That's Bigly. Liberty Bigly is my almost daily show where I come out with really short off-the-cuff episodes, maybe about 20 minutes long, and I think you'll really enjoy it, so check that out. Here's the show. Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland, and I am joined by Keith Knight. How are you doing, buddy?
Great as always, Pat. Thank you for doing this on such short notice. Her testimony was released, and I said, got to get in touch with Pat.
Yeah, you were right. I'm glad that we're back in the saddle now, and we can get together and do these episodes in a timely manner. But so this one is episode 134, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/134. So the elephant in the room, Amy Coney Barrett's first day of her the Senate Judiciary Committee Selection Committee confirmation hearing started today. And I didn't know that it was starting today. And so I was sitting in the office, and it was early in the morning, and I go through my morning routine, and part of it is just to check the Twitters now. And I saw it live streaming, so I put it on and I was watching it. But did you get to watch a lot of it, Keith?
You know what? I lied to myself and said, I'm going to watch it. I want to see how these things go down. It's too painful. I just kept skipping through. I mean, Lindsey Graham's just boring introduction. It's their usual. I mean, they were talking about the effects of Obamacare, assuming that she, if she's elected, she would overturn it, or they would then have the votes to overturn it. It was just such a waste of time. I got 100 videos on my watch later list, tons of books gathering dust. Couldn't do it. But I did think that the interesting thing was she had her mask on the entire time people were talking, so you weren't able to gauge her, I feel really bad for these kids, or you just had no clue what was going on in her head as they were grilling her, as they were talking about ACA, as they were mentioning gay marriage, as they were talking about abortion. So that really took away a lot of their power to say, look at her terribleness. So I thought that ended up working in her favor.
Yeah, the masks were interesting because I noticed some are wearing surgical masks and others are wearing like very skin tight black masks. And that's what she was wearing. And so maybe good for her. I mean, I'm sure she's practiced her stoic face on the bench. Actually, I don't know. In my experience, most judges aren't afraid to show their disdain for certain arguments with their facial expressions. So an old adage that I've learned in my practice is that, a good lawyer argues the law, but a great lawyer argues the judge.
Interesting.
So,
yeah. That's a great thing that we're going to get into once I start asking you, walking through her testimony. What first you wanted to go through Ted Cruz? Yeah,
we got a lot of stuff to go through. So we're going to start with Ted Cruz's opening statement. And before we get in, well, I'll save it till after. So if you'll bear with us, we've been trying to work out the technology here. I noticed something interesting, and we didn't think there was conspiracy behind it, but Ted Cruz's audio was atrocious on C-SPAN and on liberal media outlets, and it was not so terrible on his own YouTube channel page. So can you see the screen, Keith?
I am able to see it, yeah.
Okay, and stop me if you can't hear it, all right?
Yeah.
which is, to date, of every Democrat who's spoken, we've heard virtually not a single word about Judge Barrett.
No, I am not getting anything on
Oh, you're not.
my end.
Okay. Apologies here. This is the technology. We didn't use Skype before. We used Google Hangouts, and then they axed it, which was another episode idea, Keith, because I thought they axed it because there were too many people that were having intelligent conversations.
You know, it was a blessing in disguise because it made us less reliant on Google for one more thing.
Yeah.
And now it's Skype and Zoom, and I'm so comfortable with both of them, except for the fact that my mic doesn't get picked up on Zoom. But I'm saving up for a new computer and and a mic.
Well, I've been out of the game for so long that my savvy is not up. But here, hopefully this works.
Let's give it a shot.
Didn't bark, which is, to date, of every Democrat who's spoken, we've heard virtually not a single word about Judge Barrett. We've heard a lot of attacks at President Trump. We understand our Democratic colleagues are not supporters of the president. We've heard a lot of political rhetoric. We just heard the senator from Rhode Island directing some attacks at Senator Cornyn from Texas, and I understand there's an election in a few weeks, so that those political attacks are not surprising. But we've heard very little about the nominee who is here and whose confirmation we're considering. And I think part of the reason for that is that on any measure, Judge Barrett's credentials are impeccable. This is a woman who graduated #1 in her class at Notre Dame Law School. I'd venture to say that there is likely not a single member of this committee who graduated #1 in their class in law school. Perhaps my colleague Mike Lee can disagree with that statement, but it is a very impressive accomplishment.
I thought that zinger was pretty good.
Judge Barrett went on to be...
Just as an aside, it's a huge deal that she's going to be the first judge that didn't go to either Harvard or Yale Law School.
Yes, I did hear her mention that also. Isn't it funny that so much of politics is about attacking individuals instead of ideas? And we're always like, let's discuss principles, not what happened with Trump in that, Hollywood tape. So it's like, let's finally talk about principles. And then it's like, no. Well, now, today, we're actually going to talk about a person, so let's criticize them. And then they finally stop talking about people, and then it's on to, because all of their introductions are like, well, about the ACA, well, we'll just talk about Coney Barrett. That's what we're here for. She's,
right.
Testifying. And today was the day they decided to talk about ideas. Of course, it's still all emotional manipulation nonsense. They're like, well, these people wouldn't have had access to healthcare. Well, access to healthcare comes from entrepreneurs, investment, and innovation, not from passing laws. Oh, if only we had passed laws in the 1500s, then we would have all had healthcare universally. That ridiculous nonsense.
Now my mother, this was Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. My mother understood this, and she was a second grade teacher. Like, blow it out your ass. Like, I don't give two shits what your mom did. Oh my God. Okay. Well, let's see if he has anything more intelligent to say. And then, did you want to pause, or should we start with his piece on judicial philosophy?
Let's go right into his philosophy.
Okay.
Be a clerk to the great Justice Antonin Scalia, one of the greatest justices ever to serve on the Supreme Court. We heard celebration from Senator Leahy about the fact that he was confirmed 98-0. From there, she became a law professor for 2 decades.
Okay.
That actually
this is the part where he gets into judicial philosophy.
Misunderstands the constitutional structure. The framers of the Constitution deliberately set up a system of checks and balances so that nobody can become a Supreme Court nominee without both the president and the Senate. Each was designed to check the other. That system of checks and balances limits power ultimately and protects the voters. And indeed, the voters made a clear choice. One of the things that is clear from this discussion this morning is Democrats and Republicans have fundamentally different visions of the court, of what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, what its function is. Democratic senators view the court as a super legislature, as a policymaking body, as a body that will decree outcomes to the American people. Now, that vision of the court is something found nowhere in the Constitution. And it's a curious way to want to run a country. Even if on any particular policy issue, you might happen to agree with wherever a majority of the court is on any given day. Who in their right mind would want the United States of America ruled by 5 unelected lawyers wearing black robes? It's hard to think of a less democratic notion than unelected philosopher kings with life tenure decreeing rules for 330 million Americans. That is not, in fact, the court's job. The court's job is to decide cases according to the law and to leave policymaking to the elected legislatures. Now, look, that doesn't mean policymaking is unimportant. In fact, it means to the contrary. Policymaking is very important. And the people need to have a direct check on policymaking. You know what? If a rogue court implements policies you don't like, you, the American people, have very limited ability to check them. If a rogue Congress implements policies you don't like, you have a direct ability to check us by throwing the bums out and voting them out and voting in new representatives. You know, much of the argument this morning has concerned Obamacare. And they've been policy arguments. They're policy arguments that are actually occurring in the Senate, which is the right place for them to occur, a legislative body. But our Democratic colleagues simply want a promise from a judicial nominee that this nominee will work to implement their policy vision of health care. That is not a judge's job. That is not the responsibility of a judge. And in fact, making that promise would be violating the judicial oath. I don't know what will happen in this particular litigation on health care, but I do know that this body should be the one resolving the competing policy questions at issue. Many of our colleagues talked about pre-existing conditions, and I think they have made a political decision. They want this to be the central issue of the confirmation. Well, remember this. Every single member of the Senate agrees that pre-existing conditions can and should be protected. Period. The end. There is complete unanimity on this. Now, it so happens that there are a number of us on the Republican side that also want to see premiums go down. Obamacare has caused premiums to skyrocket. The average.
So he goes off on Obamacare there, I think, but I think that's the gist of his argument about, judicial philosophy. Oh, hold on. Are you muted, Keith? I can't hear you. There you go.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So I thought he made an important point at the end there, that it's important to mention that premiums have increased after the passing of the Affordable Care Act. So the idea that what we do is we put a resolution forward and then this brings us towards a solution. No, there's unintended consequences like this major one, which is the whole thing that they talked about for like the first hour when they were saying, this, these health insurance, these health bills were about like $50,000. What? Because there's too much voluntary exchange, there's too much freedom, there's too much free trade with other countries. That's why it's so high? Of course not. And that's why we see the least regulated, most competitive, newest industries, Uber, LASIX eyes, very competitive, very innovative, a lot of competition, a lot of choice. We see that's where prices really fall. So it's amazing that they can already get you thinking past the sale, talking about what to do now, as opposed to what caused the problem or what's morally just.
Well, I don't know how Republicans have let Democrats get away with this notion that Republicans want you to lose your health care. And maybe it's just that I haven't paid enough attention to what Republicans are actually saying. But he made a really good point, is that Republicans don't want your premiums to go up. I don't think they want you to lose your health insurance either. And I'm not one who thinks that pre-existing conditions should be covered. Maybe that's a preference that some people have, but you have to pay a higher premium for that. I mean, there's just no getting past it. Moreover, though, the healthcare industry should not at all have insurance for minor maintenance or things like that. You should have catastrophic injury insurance, I think. But that's kind of an aside, I suppose, from the judicial concept at play. This is 8th grade stuff, and Ben Sass was saying this in his confirmation hearing too, is that in his opening statement rather, is that basically this is 8th grade civics. In our system in the United States, we have separation of powers, and it's the executive branch that enforces the law, it's the legislative branch that creates the law, and it's the judicial branch that interprets the law. You can't have a mixing of the two. So anything on that, Keith?
Well, it just goes to show you that they must have so little on her. I mean, I don't know if you follow, like, the big trending anti-Amy Coney Barrett tweets are that she needs to have Child Protective Services called on her to make sure that the 2 Haitians she adopted were not slaves that she's currently keeping. Not even a joke. That one was trending. She also had, people saying, well, she has a extreme branch of Catholicism. Look, whether it's a crazy idea you get from your economic views, your family views, your religious views, your views with friends, views from books you've read, criticize that, but they're putting it in this religious realm to sort of detach it from reality. So just like Ted Cruz said, we don't need 5 people in black robes doing this. What does what they wear have anything to do with it? Well, what you do is if you put someone in the mind of the listeners in a black robe, that seems irrational and far out and nothing that I would do, just as making someone seem like a religious nut is not what the average person wants. So it's these little jabs to disassociate the idea with reality and then the person with any sense of sanity.
Ben Sass said really something. I saw Ben Sass speak at Freedom Fest, I think in 2014 or 2015. And even though, of course, he's a Republican senator and I don't agree with him on a lot of things, he really struck me as someone with high intelligence and someone who could speak really well. And he was pretty entertaining. And it made me think watching these confirmation hearings that, damn it, like the Republicans are a lot closer to what I actually believe. Maybe that's just because I'm a right libertarian, but in a certain way.
Yeah, we definitely have the same sort of constrained vision of how humans are, having limited knowledge, needing to delegate decision making, needing us to be free, and in the absence of a centrally planned state. So because we share that basic fundamental assumption, we're going to have a lot of things that follow as a causal result of the implications of that constrained vision. So certainly that's something we see there. One thing that I like what Ted Cruz talked about, which I think is a really big thing that we need to start harping on, is the importance of checks and balances. So I totally stole this from Roderick Long. Someone was saying, well, we don't need, some voluntary society and all this stuff. We just need an informed populace that's educated so they can hold politicians accountable. And Roderick Long says, yeah, education is vitally important. What's more important is checks and balances. The ultimate check and balance is the ability to stop funding organizations that aren't meeting consumer demand and the ability to disassociate, which implies every adult in a given society has the same rights. So while some may focus on being security or property protectors, or they will focus in courts, no one has inherent rights that no other person has. So the ultimate check and balance is voluntarism, the one thing that the state by definition doesn't consist of. So we need to really take their arguments and explain their own implications of the things that they say that they value.
Yeah, I really wish that they walked the walk instead of just talking the talk sometimes, even though the talk isn't perfect, But one thing I was consciously thinking as these confirmation hearings was going along is that if I was Amy Coney Barrett, I wouldn't be surprised at what's going on in the political parade that's happening and the grandstanding and all that. I wouldn't be surprised by it, but at the same time, I would be pissed that my entire judicial career, everything that I've worked toward and the values that I've held myself to, not just that, but my family and what I've built there, that it would all be reduced to this. Is in my confirmation hearing, they wouldn't even give me the respect of asking me about policy questions, but instead sit up there and grandstand. And maybe the same for Merrick Garland. Actually, there never was a confirmation hearing for him, right?
Correct. So, yeah, it was never even brought to the floor.
Or for Kavanaugh too. I remember thinking this during this time, that my entire career, everything that I've worked towards, all the struggle and pain that I've went through, and the sacrifices that I've made for this, and it's all reduced to some rape allegation that was hoked up, or insults upon my family.
And that one was totally recanted. The gang rape story was totally taken back, along with two of the other ones. So all it leaves is Christine Blasey Ford, which is an extremely questionable story. But you're totally right. It's sad that even when it's like, all right, you guys like talking about individuals and criticizing people so much, let's talk about a person. And then they're either slandering the person or bringing up unrelated nonsense.
Yeah, it was painful to watch in that sense, but it all made me think of, and I've been saying this to tons of people, so the Supreme Court should have so little power, this is my thought, it should have so little power that it doesn't matter who's on the Supreme Court. And I suppose it's the same, I've said that about the president too, but Tom Woods had a great episode where he had a guest on, and I'm not recalling his name right now, but he was saying that at the beginning, when the Supreme Court had first started, it was so insignificant that people actively avoided having the role of being on the federal Supreme Court, because it was much more esteemed to be on the state court, the state Supreme Court, and you actually had issues of controversy. And on the federal Supreme Court, it was more of an administrative magistrative position, and so people would avoid being on the court. And I just thought that was so funny. It's like, oh God, I got to do this. And there was so little for some of the justices to do that they would take other positions. So, I mean, could you imagine that? That would be great.
Every Supreme Court is like an Uber driver. Yeah, they do Uber, but they all have side hustles.
Right,
every single one of them. And just let them tell you about it. That would be fun.
Some do libertarian podcasting,
Yeah, as far as them having too much power, of course. I mean, 330 million people, sort of either totally happy because their guy gets to appoint someone, and the rest saying this is the end of everything because, Kavanaugh's going to get in. Haven't really heard that much about, it's terrible that we have Kavanaugh on that court. It's like they've forgotten about it. It's just like, but let's get people more mad at COVID. Actually, we're back to climate change now. If you saw Noam Chomsky today, so that's the new thing they're scaring us
really?
into.
Well, didn't the WHO just came out and said, actually, oh, sorry guys, the lockdown was a huge mistake and now it's a global catastrophe. So,
they did.
Yeah.
They did. That was in USA Today. There was other World Health Organization advisors saying the same thing. So that's been a big relief.
So one thing that Ted Cruz really got at, and for people who aren't in the judicial community, or I guess aren't lawyers or haven't gone to law school, the big conservative thing is if you get to the Federalist Society, and I was a vice president of the Federalist Society at my law school, and there was 4 of us in the whole group. The whole law school, there was 4 of us. But their premise is that it is a judge's job to say what the law is and not what it should be. And that is kind of the whole conservative judicial mindset. And I guess it wouldn't be super duper apparent. It wasn't super apparent to me until I was maybe a 2L why that would make sense from a judicial flaw, why that's the conservative position. And it all boils down to that separation of powers. And otherwise, from the other side, you have the activist Supreme Court, and it's funny that of the progressive era, and it's funny that your law professors in class would always point to the conservative cases where they kind of let the law be. Like there was one that struck down minimum wage laws in the early progressive era, and they thought that was like the worst Supreme Court decision ever. That was one of them. And they didn't mention how that mandatory sterilization case, I forget what it's called, Buck v. Bell, they despised that opinion, but they didn't focus on the fact that it was from, one of the largest progressive judges,
Yeah, or FDR appointing a Klansman, or for that matter, Hugo Black was his name, to the Supreme Court, or the fact that Joe Biden spoke very highly of a Klansman at his funeral not too long ago while he was sitting vice president, Robert Byrd. So, definitely not the brightest history, considering their goal is to make sure we're following the Constitution, and the state has drastically grown in virtually every way. The Constitution's never even mentioned when trying to pass a law. So that swing and a miss on the Supreme Court, but certainly you can get a lot of possible good rulings and opinions that we could use to our advantage.
The other thing I wanted to point out is that I did a lot of work on, and I'm going to share my screen here so you can see it, Keith. One of my earliest episodes was the conspiratorial corruption of the Constitution. It was the second episode. So that's at libertyweekly.net/2. And I went through my it was my 3L paper. And when you graduate law school, there's a long paper requirement. And mine, I did on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which you can get a copy of it for free if you join my email list. I think it's at libertyweekly.net/email. Or it pops up when you go to the website. But in that, there is a very interesting article written by William J. Watkins Jr. And he's someone that appeared on the Tom Woods Show a couple times. But I believe this was one of his law school papers. It's entitled Popular Sovereignty, Judicial Supremacy, and the American Revolution, Why the Judiciary Cannot Be the Final Arbiter of Constitutions. And this is like the most important work that if you wanted to understand what the problem is with the Supreme Court, this is the article. It's 100 pages long, so it's not very brief. However, if you really want to understand it, dive into this, because he goes all the way back to the Magna Carta, and maybe not all the way back to the Magna Carta, but he goes back pretty damn far. And he traces judicial philosophy all through the years. He starts in Stuart, England, and traces it all up to show exactly what the struggle is with why is it that in America we wanted to have the separation of powers. Because at the beginning it was always sovereign monarchs, and then it turned to monarchs who were only sovereign when they consulted with the barons, and then it went further to there's a constitution. It's unwritten, but there's certain things that the king just can't do. And then you have the whole American experiment where we decide, no, we're going to write things down on the Constitution, and you can't. The federal government can't go beyond this. We're going to reserve certain rights to the people. So he traces that strain of thought all through the ages. And then he touches on the Supreme Court. And the problem with the Supreme Court is that separation of powers, is that they become a legislative body with the power of judicial review. So he goes through how Justice John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison, when he made the decision, and he kind of claimed the power of judicial review, and judicial review is the power for the Supreme Court to declare a law unconstitutional. And when Justice John Marshall did that, he wasn't necessarily in the wrong, because a Supreme Court should have the power to declare a law unconstitutional. However, there is this idea, this string of case law, and I've talked about this a lot in the podcast, but there is a string of case law that he goes through in great detail here. And at the lower half, for you not watching the video version, I've been scrolling through it. But at the bottom half, I think it's on page 214 in the document, 56 in the PDF. But he talks about this string of case law in the states before the Constitution was ratified that said basically that it established what's called the clear case doctrine, which is the Supreme Court of a state can declare a law unconstitutional if it is clearly unconstitutional. If reasonable minds couldn't differ that this law is unconstitutional, then the Supreme Court can declare it so and strike it down. However, if reasonable people could differ about the constitutionality of a law, then the Supreme Court should send the law back to the legislature and tell them to vote on it or change it. And so that, in fact, it was an impeachable offense at the state Supreme Court level for justices to declare a law unconstitutional that wasn't clearly debatable. That wasn't reasonable minds could differ on the constitutionality of a law. If reasonable minds could differ about the constitutionality, you send it back to the legislature. It is impeachable for you to strike that law down. That is going beyond the purview of the court and going into judicial activism. So sorry for that monologue, Keith, but that's just to get that point out there, is this is what I did in my law school class. So that's the root of the issue here.
Yeah, definitely important stuff. Of course, we will strongly disagree with the existence of a state monopolizing law and everything. Yep. But that doesn't mean that in no way means we can't appreciate legal opinions that have been derived. For example, there was one that Dave Smith read from a judge in Pennsylvania about this anti-lockdown ruling. Just beautiful. What a contribution to the ideas of freedom. And you have to appreciate that, look, if we were born in 1500, 1600, 1700, we would not have figured out the state's illegitimate on our own. We would have been working 14-hour days with no time to even contemplate any of this stuff. So, yeah, going into the history and even Supreme Court decisions today, you can really look at and hopefully learn and improve, just like technology improves, philosophy, understanding of society, and morality can improve as well.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll go against what you said about in the 1600s we wouldn't have realized the state's illegitimate, because the levelers, he talks about that, the levelers were a group of people in England during the English Civil War, and that's really where the strain of our own modern libertarian thought comes from them. It's not super direct in that it changes a bit, but that's where he traces it back to. So everybody's got to read that. I know it's 100 pages, but it's just, it's great.
Well, when you use the word article, yes, 100 pages is a lot. But if you say there's a book and it's only 100 pages, well, then I go book, big, time consuming, 100 pages. I could do that. That's an enemy of the state twice.
I should consult you about how to phrase things, Keith.
But legal articles and reviews, I'm familiar with how they're usually spoken of.
Yeah.
So, any final words on what we're going, or can we start part 2?
Yeah, let's start part 2 and get into Amy Coney Barrett.
So, before we go into it, explain what a statute is. Not that I don't know, but for everyone listening. Yeah.
So, a statute, there's this idea of natural law versus positive law. And a statute basically is a dictate of the legislature. It's positive law. It's something that's created by a body of people. And as opposed to natural law or the common law, which is law that comes about naturally through what people are just doing on their own, it comes from custom. It also comes from what a circuit court is supposed to do. A trial court is supposed to find the law. And find the law through working through problems and how people are solving them on their own level and by themselves. So one is organic and one is unnatural.
See, I think that's vitally important for us because we both correctly see houses and restaurants as private property. Why is it okay to just walk into one and on the other you have to knock? Well, come on, you know the rules, you know what people want, you know how when they display something, that would be a statute as opposed to, something, or you might actually consider that. Either way, it allows us to have sort of a different view and more of a conceptual idea of what's expected of human beings. Is it you went to the store, so now your house is mine since you didn't occupy it? No. Well, what if you don't go to your house for 500 years and then your family returns? Well, at some point in the middle, we could find an equilibrium. So thank you for that. She just mentioned, I decided my passion for words was better suited to deciphering statutes than novels. So I want clarity on that. She says, when I went to college, it never occurred to me that anyone would consider girls to be less capable than boys. I thought that was really nice to hear because I don't hear the racism and the sexism in America that the left always claims is there. And they go, well, no questioning. It was there, some time ago. I just get such a sigh of relief when I hear, some high elected official or someone in a high position just say, hey, this SJW false division stuff, let's get rid of it. Do you have any thoughts on either of those first two things about just her personal remarks?
Well, I think it was really funny because I was an English major in undergrad too. I don't know if I was thinking about grad school for English, but I ended up turning towards the law as well. It is refreshing and I appreciate it that a woman wouldn't, she wouldn't hang everything on that hook. She just goes out and does it. You know what I mean? She doesn't expect accolades for it or anything, but she's just like, yeah, I'm here. Let's do the law.
Dude, yesterday I found out that the comedian Dillon Is Gay, and I couldn't believe it. I go, what? He's never mentioned it. I've listened to tens of hours of his hilarious podcast, and it turns out he is. And the very first comment on the video where he talks about it was, Tim Dillon is what happens when the most interesting thing about you isn't your gender or sexuality. And I'm like, that's a perfect way. It's like, yes. There's a reason Amy Coney Barrett is very interesting to listen to comparatively to an SJW who, like, getting through a tweet, I have to pause, take a sip. I get triggered at their triggering. So it's just a loop of, people being overly sensitive. So yes, I really appreciate that from her.
Yeah, you are so right. And I've put it this way too, is that, for my own self, when I was super duper into libertarianism all the time, I thought I started to become the thing that I hated about SJWs is that they were always defined by their sexuality or their race or something like that. And now I feel like I've reached a place where, there's lots of different things about me, but specifically with Amy Coney Barrett. Yes. The most interesting thing about her is definitely her judicial philosophy. I mean, it's also her family, and her kids in that background and balancing being a mom with, but I guess that has to do with her gender, but I think it has more to do with her lifestyle. Like for instance, Tucker Carlson, if you see a picture of him with his family, it is very clear that his family is very important to him. And that's a huge part of what he does. So I enjoy that about Tucker,
There's that great meme, Tucker Carlson's family, him and his whole family smiling and hugging. Don Lemon's family, him and his boyfriend.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
And dude, that is so true. I fortunately have made sure that, I really try to find a balance of, not being defined by investing myself in the thing that I only am in to hate this other thing called the state. Dude, what a terrible place that would be. So but very good that we found that equilibrium.
Yeah, and I would say I have, but we're going to talk more about that in our next episode. I think
we will
talked about that. Okay.
No spoilers. Okay.
Yeah.
She goes on. So she clerked for Justice Scalia. His judicial philosophy was straightforward. A judge must apply the law as written, not as the judge wishes it were. This really brings us into the different views of the world that I mentioned previously. The constrained versus the unconstrained vision of, gosh, what I am dealing with is the combination of so many brilliant minds over so many centuries. This is what I should defer to. Even though I really think this is wrong, I should defer to that. That's certainly showing some humility. However, once you're at that level, you should have the confidence to recognize that morality is objective. Because the question is, all right, what was it, Dred Scott, where they basically, just enslaved a runaway? You have to be willing to say that there are lines you can't cross. I thought that's extremely disappointing. And the fact that that wasn't mentioned at all, no real natural law foundation, no sense of objective morality. I got to say, I just hate that that's totally ignored. Thoughts on a judge must apply the law as written, not as the judge wishes it were.
Yeah, there's a certain jurist who I know personally that I really admire because she's able to do this. And I've discussed with her, in my career, just that in the past, she's had to make decisions like this, where she kind of wants it to be a certain way, but she knows what the law is, and that's always foremost in her mind, is what the law is and trying to make the correct call based on that. And I think it's probably really hard to do. But one quality I think that judges have, or they should have, is they can't be afraid to make an unpopular decision. And that takes a lot of balls, and you have to not give a crap what other people think. And I think that's really hard. And it's the peer pressure too, not only trying to be an activist, but it is the peer pressure. And that pressure can be very hard, or the fear of being embarrassed, or the feel of, this is the same fear you probably have all experienced recently. Do I wear a mask in the grocery store or do I not? So I think that on one level, it's easy to be an armchair jurist and say, this is what it should be. And it's easy to do that with everything, but to actually walk the walk, that's hard to do. And someone who can actually do that, I really appreciate. But there's another thing to get into here, is this idea of an objective law and an objective morality, because I think that reasonable minds could differ about what that objective law is. And so we get into a lot of, this is a really deep topic that might warrant a whole other episode, but I tend to think more so that even though we believe that there is an objective law, I think reasonable minds could differ about how the NAP is applied. And on some level too, I think that what we're looking for is a free market in the production of law itself. That being said, I could envision a society where certain cultures, the NAP would apply maybe differently. I'm working this thought out as I'm speaking it right now, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
Well, yeah, and you're completely right. Let's just say we weren't all on the same page about the Kyle Rittenhouse. We're not all on the same page about abortion, and that's just anarcho-capitalist libertarians who are in my age group. So that's a really narrow demographic. If we can't all agree on something like that, how do we get other people to? So the point is not to say there's complexity, so we can't have a free market. No, the fact that there is complexity is why you need the ability to have competition, the ability to opt out, and for people to know, if I don't produce good law, people are going to go elsewhere. So yes, it is the production that increases the likelihood we will get the best desired results, rather than, because as I constantly say, every criticism you could have of voluntarily funded competition applies tenfold to a coercively funded monopoly. She goes on, sometimes that approach meant reaching results that he did not like, referring to Scalia. But as he put it in one of his best known opinions, that is what it means to say we have a government of laws, not of men. What are your thoughts on the term, we should be a nation of laws, not of men?
That's a pretty loaded statement, and I guess I don't really know what to say. Is that, oh, well, maybe it's the difference between this common law and positive law. I think you could make that connection. Is that we should be guided by, I guess maybe that doesn't fit. What do you think, Keith?
I think it's a false dichotomy. I think it's the equivalent of saying, it's not Congress voting, this is the people. No, it's the Congress every time.
Yeah.
So when they say it's not a government of laws, or it's not a government of men, it's a government of laws. Give me a law that applies the same to two men. Let's start with something really simple. Don't give me this 72,000 page IRS. Let's start with Amendment number 1, freedom of speech. Can I talk about where Patrick lives and why we should kill him? Well, no, but isn't that freedom of speech? Can I give out enemy secrets to the enemy during wartime? Is that freedom of speech? Can I yell fire in a crowded theater? Which, by the way, I think I've told this, we used to do in middle school, and it was so fun because nothing would ever happen. So this idea that we need to regulate speech or people would scream fire, we do it all the time because we were conservatives, just trying to push the limits a little, and nothing ever happened. So it again is just telling you, watch out for this terrible thing. That everyone looked at us and just said, oh, idiots. So, okay, so those three things that come to mind. Julian Assange, there are people who say he should be tried for war crimes, even though he just used his speech. It's not of laws. It's always of men. It depends on what motivates the men and under which system they have justified powers. And so I think not understanding that is what gives the state a lot of its power. It's important to just recognize it. This is laws of people who have come to their decisions, and then we can start criticizing them, but we have to recognize the reality. It's not this, Platonic ideal that's just objectively imposed. It's a judge's interpretation. The Second Amendment, those are just the first two amendments. Mm-hmm. Think about all the laws ever. So yeah, that is what's loosely referred to as the myth of the rule of law by John Hasness.
Well, maybe I think what I'm trying to do is ascribe the most generous position to Justice Scalia, which would be that there's this idea of that the law is objective and we should be a nation based on this objective law, or the NAP, and not a nation of men, something that's ruled, by the tyranny of the majority or by popular opinion. And yeah. So a note on Justice Scalia is in law school, when we were in our constitutional law classes and all those, everyone hated Justice Scalia, but I thought at the same time, some of them respected him. There was some kind of a respect there for his opinions and for his wit and for, his colorful opinions. And I don't know if that's going to exist anymore. I don't know if that was like a real kind of respect, like a mutual disagreement respect, or a hatred. I can't be too sure.
Dude, mutual disagreements. I mean, when they were just talking about Scalia getting voted 98-0, I don't see any judge anytime soon getting a, vast majority to 0 sort of thing that Elena Kagan got, Sonia Sotomayor got after Kavanaugh. Now with, Ginsburg leaving, that's not going to happen. This is very related. She says, Scalia taught me more than just law. He was devoted to his family, resolute in his beliefs, and fearless of criticism. As I embarked on my own legal career, I resolved to maintain that same perspective. There's a tendency in our profession to treat the practice of law as all-consuming while losing sight of everything else, but that makes for a shallow and unfulfilling life. I worked hard as a lawyer and as a professor. I owed that to my clients, my students, and myself, but I never let the law define my identity or crowd out the rest of my life. Showing a little bit of depth, that's kind of nice. Thoughts on that?
It's a balance, and it's a very real balance. She's not kidding when she says that the practice of law really starts to become all-encompassing. I mean, and what you really need, as in with every professional field and blue collar jobs and everything too, you need a mentor. You need someone who's going to take you under their wing and show you the ropes. And that can be the difference between a successful career and an unsuccessful career. But you got to have that balance. And, you know, the audience and everyone, you only really see a small sliver of what it's like, at least for me. And I've tried to take, with my show, I've tried to take the audience on the journey with me. And so I hope that people who have been listening to the show for quite a long time have been able to kind of see that. But it is a struggle. It's a real struggle to live both lives. Well, you know, all your different lives. But it is very easy. I mean, there's so much damn work that goes with it. And getting so emotionally, you're not supposed to get emotionally attached to your cases and your clients, but you do, you know, and when you lose, it eats a small little part of you, you know. And I think maybe you're going to talk about this, but I think she mentions it, that having these feelings when she's reading cases, she tries to picture herself as each one of the litigants and see how her decision is going to affect them, because for them, every single case is the most important case of their life. So that's a lot of weight to put on your shoulders.
Barrett continues, a similar principle applies to the role of courts. Courts have a vital responsibility to enforce the rule of law, which is critical to a free society. But courts are not designed to solve every problem or right every wrong in our public life. The policy decisions and value judgments of government must be made by the political branches elected by and accountable to the people. The public should not expect courts to do so, and courts should not try. Anything of value there?
I think that in a libertarian system, we wouldn't have to deal with this whole separation of powers issue. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think over this summer, it's become very apparent exactly how tyrannical the rule of the mob can be in this lawlessness, not only on the side of the mob rule, but also on the side of the police, which, okay, you know, potato, potato. But at the same time, when the police don't abide by the law, and Tim Pool said something about this with these Antifa rioters in Portland that were just surrounded because they got snitched on. And so they were surrounded, but there's a video of it and you can see the police talking about a temporary restraining order that was put in by the city government. And he said, I don't give two F's about this TRO. So on one hand, you have the rule of the mob, the literal mob, and then you have the rule of the organized mob, and neither of them care about the rule of law. So when we get into this talk about dropping the anarchy word, and we try and make that distinction between, no, it doesn't mean no rules, because that would be something without the rule of law. And I think that's real tyranny.
Yeah, there is a great book written by, I think he's a lawyer, Randy Barnett, called The Structure of Liberty. The best part about it is there's a summary at the end of each chapter. So it takes 10 minutes to reread the summaries, and then you get the whole book. He really makes a great case that there is a legal reasoning behind having a society without a state, which there's still law. As I mentioned with Stephan Kinsella, he has a new book coming out, which you got to have him on to talk about. Law in a Libertarian World, I think it's going to be called. But him and I were talking about it, and he just explains what law is in a society and says, by the way, usually a group comes along and tries to monopolize this, and that's what the state is. So it's like there is no real intrinsic, the state and the law. It's just one of the things they try to monopolize, like, you know, they try to do with healthcare or anything else. She goes on, that is the approach I have strived to follow as a judge on the Seventh Circuit. In every case, I have carefully considered the arguments presented by the parties, discussed the issues with my colleagues on the court, and done my utmost to reach the result required by law, whatever my own personal preference may be. I don't like that she kind of constantly goes back to this. That there's no objective rule. There's just that which is. And she kind of bends over to that tyranny. That's a little That's a little disappointing. I try to remain mindful that while my court decides thousands of cases each year, each case is the most important one to the parties involved. After all, cases are not like statutes, which are often named for their authors. Cases are named for the parties who stand to gain or lose in the real world, often through their liberty or livelihood. Thoughts on that paragraph?
Yeah, it's pretty hard. I mean, when you're a litigant, your case really is the most important thing going on in your life. You try, to set it to the side, but oftentimes it goes on for years, at least in the civil system. Maybe in a criminal system, it goes for a year and a half. But do you want to elaborate a bit? Can you read that section over again where she talks about there not being an objective answer?
What she specifically said was, I mean, she sort of bends it on and off. In every case, I've carefully considered the arguments presented by the parties, discussed the issue with my colleagues on the court, and done my utmost to reach the result required by the law, whatever my own personal preferences might be. So that, to me, when you say preferences, it's a lot different to say, I have a preference for Olive Garden as opposed to TGI Fridays. But when you're talking about, enslaving people, starting wars that kill people, sanctioning countries that kill civilians, I feel like there should be an elevated importance of this is right and this is wrong, especially if you're supposed to be one of the greatest minds that holds such a high seat in such, an important country like America.
I think this is where libertarian jurists differ with conservative jurists then, because as if you're a conservative jurist, okay, well, there's a super unjust result, but it's the law, so I have to apply it that way. Whereas, we would say, if it's morally incorrect, it's illegal according to the NAP, that's my guiding. Maybe the guiding stars are different. You know what I mean?
They are, but the conservative is caught in a contradiction. If the American Revolution was illegal, then their moral justification for what the law is illegal. So they're in the contradiction of, well, you violently overthrew this government illegally, so anything it does is not legitimate. You need to abide by, the previous legislature. So what they're really saying is this is what's generally accepted to be. That's what I'm going to continue to do. Now, there are some cases where that's true. I'm trying to think of a meeting of the minds case. So that would be meeting of the minds. You go to the bar and, you get, you just ask for 2 beers and then ask for the bill and they say that'll be $9 million. Well, no, because I've been here before. I know it's like between $7 and $9 a beer. Even though I didn't specify, we have a general understanding because there's always room for more fine print of, well, you basically, you sat here for a long time and now we're going to charge you rent because that counts as renting out this booth. You never asked us if there was a fee. There is a general tendency to have an understanding just because it's efficient. The cost is too high to, agree on every single little thing. So you end up having those, and that would be a case of, well, what's the custom in this culture? All right, then you should have expected that you have to tell them if something is going to be $1 million for a drink, because there are wines that are like 100,000, so it's possible.
Right.
But you have to let them know. Again, the existence of, having clear contracts in no way justifies a monopoly state. Barrett continues, when I write an opinion resolving a case, I read every word from the perspective of the losing party. I ask myself, how would I view the decision if one of my children was the party I was ruling against? Even though I would not like the result, would I understand that the decision was fairly reasoned and grounded in the law? That is the standard I set for myself in every case, and it is the standard I will follow as long as I am judge on any court. That's pretty much the last thing I had highlighted. Thoughts on that final statement?
She has a lot of faith in litigants, thinking that they're going to calmly and rationally think through the court's decision-making process. I mean, I've already had an appeal that went to the appeals court and I lost. And I thought for sure that I was going to win. But, I guess I calmly and rationally thought through their arguments and could understand why I didn't win. But, yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about, there's Amy Coney Barrett, as far as I know. I don't know if she ever was a trial court judge, because the difference between, I don't want to go off too far here, but the difference between a trial court and an appeals court is that the trial court is supposed to find the facts. So they try to determine what happened. And it's often said that trial courts have a lot of discretion to make certain calls. It's just the nature of the trial court. And I think that if you're in an appeals court, I think you have less discretion, and it seems like there's maybe more of what an objective answer would be. But it seems like, my problem with the appeals court and the Supreme Court, or at least the Supreme Court, is that they just seem to make up law. They just make it up out of nowhere and can justify it afterwards. You can come to a certain decision and then justify it legally afterwards, and anyone can do that because they're damn smart. Insidious but smart.
Definitely. So that is basically the remainder. I did highlight the fact that Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman on the court, which I totally forget about. That, because RBG is really seen as the one who gets all the attention for, really representing women and opening up, a pathway for women in the legal profession. That just goes to show you how married people are to the cultural aspect of things. And that's something that, we certainly, of course, we still have a division of labor within the freedom movement. Let's specialize in our things. We got to realize that you can totally erase the fact that, Republicans appointed a black guy on the Supreme Court. They appointed, the first woman. Higher percentage of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act. They were against the enslavement of blacks from the foundation of their party, and they're seen as racist. That's the racist party in America. So,
Hey, do I got you?
Hey, you got me now.
Okay.
I was just saying it's incredible how the narrative is controlled when the reality is so far from the truth. That's all I got for you. Always good to talk to you, Pat.
Yeah. Why don't you plug where the listeners can find your content?
One place that I would ask them, I am on YouTube, so please subscribe there. I know it's very easy. If you could please subscribe to my Library, Minds, and BitChute accounts, just to know that there's a soft place to land on if I get banned from YouTube. I was actually flagged again the other day for something. So I don't know what the strike policy is. I think they're just doing takedowns without permanent strikes. Either way, I'm on thin ice. People are getting banned constantly all the time. Adam Kokesh was just banned. So I would greatly appreciate if people subbed to me on the alternative channels.
All right. Yeah. And I'll put links in the show notes page, libertyweekly.net/134. So I think that's everything that we got for you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.